Welcome to Chapter 2 of the recording for the Methane Abatement Handbook. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about plans to reduce methane emissions. We are welcomed with a special guest today, Ms. Nadira Ogier, who's an advisor with the Oceans and Natural Resources Division of the Common Law Secretariat, where they provide technical assistance on good governance for the petroleum sector, which includes managing methane emissions. So for those of you who've already watched Chapter 1, you're familiar with the process. Essentially, we will have a high-level overview of this chapter, Chapter 2, during this presentation, but encourage everyone to take a look at the handbook. So on this slide, you can see the link where you can access the full text of the handbook. So Chapter 2 in detail, you can take a look at there. And then if you have any other questions. I would like to recognize our funder and supporter for this handbook, the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Energy Resources, for all their help. And with that, Nadira, over to you.
Thanks very much, Priya. And thank you very much for joining us as we do a high-level summary of Chapter 2 in the Methane Abatement Handbook. I want to just quickly cover some of the key takeaways from this chapter, which fantastically, there are a number of countries, dozens actually, who are already in action along this journey of developing methane action plans. That there are a number of resources available to help countries prepare abatement plans, detailed roadmaps, and also more and more countries are also developing specific regulations to address methane. Critically, as we know, each country's circumstances are very different, as well as the state of the industry. And these critical factors in how a country can abate methane. So as we jump into it, one of the key things that many countries have been developing is national methane action plans. There are well over 50 countries that are currently working or already have methane action plans in place. And in principle, what this does is a high-level overview of not only the ambitions that a country has on each of the areas where there are methane emissions, but an outline of how these targets will be met. And the process in general for developing methane action plans is kind of captured quite nicely in this graphic here, where in order to determine national methane goals, targets, and to have key performance indicators, really it starts with understanding what the methane emissions are, having a baseline and an inventory if possible, to identify where the opportunities are. And when that is done, there is a process under which you evaluate, you compare the options. You then have an ability to prioritize what these options are. And as you implement, track progress, learn, communicate, and share. And there are a number of resources and partners that are available and have a lot of open source tools for each of these processes, each stage in this process, to help with the development of methane action plans. Just want to highlight the Methane Roadmap Action Plan that the Climate and Clean Air Coalition have developed and can be sourced on their website. Here are just 4 examples of countries that have national methane action plans in place. And as I mentioned earlier, how countries tackle this can be very, very different depending on their circumstance. So here we have 4, and each country has a very different approach to how they have tackled and plan to tackle methane. So for example, within Ghana's approach, it's actually incorporated into their plans under the short-lived climate pollutants action plans that they have. And within Canada, as an example, there is a very specific methane strategy. So again, very different approaches across countries. And within the chapter, there is a case study on Vietnam, which goes into further detail on Vietnam's action plan and the specifics around how it was developed. Also, in terms of looking, as I mentioned, one of the key things is in developing your abatement plan, there are three sort of key areas around this. And this is drawing on the IEA's regulatory roadmap and toolkit, and thinking about abatement plans under three broad buckets. So first, really trying to understand the setting and the context that is within a country, then the specific regulatory aspects within the country, which will inform the methane action plan and the particular options available there, and then the actual implementation. Again, this is covered in further detail in the chapter itself. And in understanding and prioritizing how we tackle the different options, it really boils down to then identifying for each opportunity that we have, what's the relative cost and benefit for each of those. The IEA have a very useful tool, the Global Methane Tracker, which provides estimates of methane emissions on a country-by-country basis, as well as an estimate on the various abatement options. And within each of these, there is a methane abatement cost curve that can be generated for each country. I encourage you to have a look if you can. Another very useful tool is the Clean Air Task Force, their COMAT tool, which is a country methane abatement tool, very similar in principle to what I've just described that the IEA has as well. So again, another very useful tool that is available to all to have a look at. And these tools, in essence, help by visually enabling us to see what the various options are and looking at it visually along a marginal abatement cost curve. And this just identifies for each of the opportunities for reducing methane, looking at what the relative cost is and the relative benefit. So these have been developed by various experts and can include within them and do include within them estimates for not only the capital cost, but the ongoing operating cost. And so these considerations are used to generate, ideally, what are the highest levers to pursue reducing methane. For policymakers, one of the key things that is incorporated into these tools is looking at the global warming potential. And this just recognizes that methane has, in the short term, significantly higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide. So in particular, in the short term, quite often in the 20-year time frame, we use 84 times higher than carbon dioxide. And in the longer term, over 100 years plus, it still is higher, but it is only by a lower amount. But in general, this is why, given a very short time period for us to really limit climate change, this is really the key opportunity and why methane is really being focused. Because the more that we can tackle methane, it delivers much more bang in the short term. As we think also about how to tackle methane in the oil and gas sector, different countries have different starting points. For some countries who have very mature production, a numerous amount of facilities and wells, the issues around reducing methane will be very different from those who are now starting out. And in general, the opportunities for new projects or new countries who are building facilities, it's a lot easier to embed a lot of the best practices and the facilities, the use of the technologies to limit and reduce methane from the start. For those who are early, mid-stage, and late, of course, the opportunities are very different, and retrofitting does have a lot higher cost than designing from the get-go. So the majority of a country's sector is one of the key considerations in designing and looking at what the abatement opportunities are in a country. Some other areas that will influence the methane abatement cost curve and the opportunities that countries have are the costs within the countries, also the availability of supply chain services, so local services and availability of parts and personnel to implement these options. Broader supply chain and logistics considerations also need to be considered. And of course, there are windows of opportunities depending on local weather conditions. For example, when certain activities can occur. These also will influence particular countries' policies and action plans. As I mentioned, new versus existing sources is also a key criteria. When designing a new facility, it's a lot easier to tackle and avoid methane in the first instance. So one example is to use renewable energy for power generation rather than a hydrocarbon-based source of fuel. And that also gives you quite often additional benefits for example, deck space. So here again, if new facilities are designed with the best available mitigation technologies, it is very possible to attain near zero methane emissions for those projects. With that, thank you again. I encourage you to have a deeper dive into chapter 2. It goes into a lot more detail on some of the issues that I've just touched on here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation. Again, take a look at the handbook if you have any questions on what was covered in this chapter. And again, thank you to our funder, the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Energy Resources.